You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, here from New York City. And on this episode, I'm glad to be joined by two guests, both joining me from Geneva, Switzerland. Joining me are John Borry and Wilfred Wan of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. I'll ask John and Wilfred to introduce themselves in a bit, but I did want to give listeners a preview of what this discussion will be about. So I recently had the great pleasure of contributing to a volume prepared by UNIDIR, where John and Wilfred work, on nuclear risk reduction. This was really a tremendous honor, and the project is just out this week. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to devote this episode to talking about some of the concerns raised in the report about nuclear risks in the Asia Pacific, a familiar topic for listeners of this podcast. We've done quite a few episodes on nuclear issues around the region. But before jumping into the discussion, and first of all, before asking John and Wilfred to introduce themselves, I did want to note that both of them are participating on this podcast in their capacity as researchers personally. They're not presenting any kind of institutional position on behalf of UNIDIR or the United Nations at large. So, John, do you want to kick us off with just briefly telling our listeners a little bit about who you are and what UNIDIR is?
Yeah, sure. Well, hi there, Ankit, and it's a pleasure to be on the show. My name's John Borry. As you can probably hear, I'm not another American. I'm from New Zealand. Many years ago, I was a New Zealand diplomat, but these days I coordinate the Institute's research, and I'm the program lead for weapons of mass destruction and other strategic weapons. So UNIDIR is a 40-year-old organization. We're an institute within the UN family, and we're directly concerned with supporting disarmament negotiations, particularly in the nuclear field, but actually all across different issues. We're a very international institute. We have people of nationalities from all over the world. And we have, over the years, carried out a lot of work in the nuclear disarmament and nuclear risk field. And Wilfred can tell you more about that.
Great, and that's a great segue. Thanks for setting us up, John. It is nice to hear your delightful accent on this podcast, so I hope our listeners enjoy listening to your voice as much as I do. Wilfred, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Ankit, for having us on the podcast. So I'm Wilfred Wan. I'm a researcher leading UNIDIR's work on nuclear risk reduction. My background is in political science, and I've written on things like non-proliferation, disarmament, and arms control before.
Great, fantastic. So let's dive right in. Before we get to the report more broadly, I know that UNIDIR has been doing work on nuclear risk reduction for a while now, and this report did just come out. But Wilfred, I believe our first encounter personally was here in New York back on the sidelines of the UN First Committee in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, when much of this work was getting off the ground. So can you tell us a little bit about the nuclear risk reduction framework that UNIDIR has been working on, and what exactly nuclear risk reduction is more broadly?
Yeah, I'm very happy to do that, Ankit. So when we talk about nuclear risk reduction, we're talking about reducing the possibility that any use of nuclear weapons, intentional or inadvertent, takes place. And so this can include a range of activities, for instance, to improve the safety and security of nuclear weapons, to lessen the risk of accidents, and to lower the possibility for miscalculation in crisis. Now, risk reduction is not a new topic. It emerged first during the Cold War, when the US and the Soviet Union took steps to prevent another Cuban Missile Crisis from happening. But the topic has really re-emerged the last few years on the agendas of a number of state-led initiatives and multilateral forums. And so why is it important now? Why is UNIDIR been involved the last few years on this topic? And I think it's really because there's genuine concern about the state of risk today, and quite well-founded concern for a number of reasons. This includes the increasing tension and rivalry among nuclear armed states, the erosion of global nuclear arms control and disarmament, the continued presence and reliance on nuclear weapons, the blurring line in conventional and nuclear capabilities, and simply the limits of our knowledge, including on weapons programs. And we can talk about all of these later, but These various trends, I think, have really driven calls for practical risk reduction measures that can have value in themselves, but also contribute to rebuilding some of the trust and confidence in the current landscape.
Right. So tell us now a little bit about the report that I briefly alluded to. It's organized across 9 chapters, taking looks at the issue of risk reduction, primarily but not entirely through a geographically divided lens. But tell us a bit about the contributors and what this volume was really trying to do.
Sure. When we talk about risk, it's universal. That is, nuclear risk exists so long as nuclear weapons do. But that said, risk manifests quite differently across different situations. It's intertwined with the nuclear characteristics of particular states as well as their security relations and so forth. And so with this volume, we really wanted to get into some regional and contextual analysis of the risk in these different situations. And we were very happy to have a number of experts, yourself included, as well as people like Tanya Ogilvie-White, Hassan El-Batimi, Ulrich Kuhn, to look at these different regions of the world in which nuclear weapons prominently feature. And I think it's by taking this kind of regional lens, then we can move on to prescribe risk reduction measures that are appropriate to each context.
Mm-hmm. Well, so John, I wanted to maybe now start zeroing in a little bit on the issue of nuclear risks in Asia. Wilfred began his description of the report and of nuclear risk reduction more broadly by alluding to the shifting environment in arms control, or rather the dissolving of traditional arms control arrangements. We can talk about the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, something we've covered on the podcast before. But when we look at Asia today, and particularly we look at the American perspective on Asia, we start to see evidence that so-called great power competition between the United States and China on one hand and the United States and Russia on the other is really manifesting in the nuclear space as well, particularly the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which is due up for expiration in February 2021, still not extended. Time is quickly running out, and the Trump administration appears quite intent on drawing China into a future treaty arrangement of some sort, be that a new type of New START or something new entirely. There have been a variety of proposals, some vaguer than others, getting at this. China continues to be quite opposed to the entire idea of sitting down at a table with Russia and the United States to talk about its nuclear arsenal. So, John, tell us a little bit about what our listeners should be aware of when it comes to this broader issue of next generation arms control, I guess we might be able to say, and the possibility of China being drawn into such an arrangement.
Yeah, absolutely, Ankit. And I think you used the phrase "the evaporation of arms control" in your chapter in the study, and I think that's quite apt. I mean, in hindsight, we look back at the mid-90s, and that was probably the high point of sort of legally binding arms control agreements. And there was a lot of optimism at that time after the end of the Cold War that all sorts of things might be possible. But in fact, with the return of this sort of great power competition after the US's fairly brief unipolar moment, we can see these increasing tensions, and the US-China relationship is one of the foremost amongst them. But also in North Asia, of course, it's a complicated situation for reasons you're well aware of, and probably many of your listeners as well. But you have the situation with North Korea, this nuclear arms state, which is not really it's sort of seen beyond the pale by many other states. You have states that certainly have the technological know-how to go nuclear but haven't done so, like Japan and South Korea. And you have these increasing tension between states in the region. And I was earlier listening to, I think, your previous podcast episode where you were talking about recent developments, for example, with Taiwan and the South China Sea. So all of these things are leading to increasing tension. And On top of that, we have a number of technologies which are either making a return or they're emerging now, and these include things like advances in missile defenses. We can see also anti-satellite weapons and counter space capabilities of various kinds becoming of increasing concern. And we also see advanced missile technologies like hypersonics, the Chinese DF-17, for example. But we also have a number of American systems under development, and the Russians are doing their thing. Plus, we have kind of enabling technologies in the cyber and, of course, the AI field, which all of these things are contributing to increased strategic unpredictability. So it's making it more difficult for war planners, strategic planners, nuclear planners to be able to figure out how should they prepare for worst case scenarios, and what are those scenarios. So there's a real role for arms control here in the new era to assist with that in order to create a bit more predictability and stability. But it's probably not going to look like the arms control we've seen in the past of exhaustive, legally binding agreements that run to hundreds of pages, like the Chemical Weapons Convention, for example. We're going to see non-legally binding agreements, probably unilateral declarations or joint statements that might be filled out in other ways through exchanges of information and increasing transparency. And maybe those things will lead to kind of more constraining, legally binding things down the track. But it's hard to see that at the moment, given current tensions.
I think that's quite right. The point that I think I raised in my chapter is the role of strategic mistrust. I mean, it's no secret that the United States and the Soviet Union, after living through a few near scares, most notably the Cuban Missile Crisis, managed to actually do some work on arms control, even in an environment of heightened mistrust, recognizing that the benefits of transparency and constrained arsenals would be worth it even in a time of heightened competition. That sort of an understanding, I think, doesn't quite exist right now between the United States and China. And of course, ever since the global pandemic broke out, I think we're seeing the intensification of mistrust, certainly on issues when it comes to transparency. Some of our listeners might not be aware, since it wasn't a huge story, but we've just had, again, an allegation from the Trump administration in its latest arms control compliance report that China is conducting some kind of surreptitious nuclear testing that doesn't adhere to the U.S. understanding of the zero yield standard. I'm not going to say more on that because it will start to get a little bit too wonky, perhaps. But I think all of these things come together to paint a rather pessimistic picture for the future of arms control. But perhaps we will see arms control arising out of necessity on some level. And in this lesson, I think it's instructive to think about the role that previous crises have played. But speaking of crises, I know there's a lot of interest. I was actually considering if this week the podcast might have had to actually cover North Korea, given the current rumor mill around the world concerning the health of Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader. Of course, we're not here to talk about Kim Jong-un's medical reports per se, but Wilfred, I wanted to give you a chance to tell us a little bit about Tanya's chapter, Tanya Ogilvy-White's chapter on Northeast Asia and North Korea. We heard a bit from John about South Korea and Japan. It's also interesting when we think about Asia and we think about nuclear risk reduction to consider the role that the beneficiaries of American extended nuclear deterrence, like Seoul and Tokyo, the role that they have to play in potential nuclear escalation scenarios in Northeast Asia. But tell us a bit about North Korea. I mean, it's certainly the newest nuclear possessor. It's the one that I think global thinking has shifted on the most in the last, let's say, 5 years in terms of just where they've come with their indigenous capabilities. What are some of the things pertaining to nuclear risks that our listeners should be most aware of in the context of Northeast Asia and North Korea specifically?
Sure. So I think Tanya in her chapter does a really nice job of kind of piecing together some of the issues that exist in the context of the Korean Peninsula. And she highlights, first and foremost, just simply the general secrecy that exists around the nuclear weapons program in North Korea, and really the overall decision-making process. There's no official nuclear doctrine that outlines, for instance, the circumstances in which North Korea plans or is willing to consider the use of nuclear weapons. The capabilities, our knowledge about the capabilities of North Korea's nuclear weapons program is at times kind of a guess, right? And it's taken from these other external sources. And so this secrecy around the program really makes it quite difficult and has as a domino effect on war planning, on the doctrine of other states. And John alluded to this in his previous response as well. Another aspect of risk in Northeast Asia, which John talked about, is the tension and conflict that exists, including with U.S. allies, and the hostile relations and the constant military propagations create these opportunities for escalation that could include nuclear use, which is quite a concern. And one thing I would also highlight here is simply our lack of knowledge about the North Korean nuclear program suggests that unauthorized access and the possibility of accidents cannot be ruled out as well.
Mm-hmm. So something that I briefly talk about North Korea in my chapter, and not to keep going back to it, but one of the most interesting things I think about when it comes to North Korea's own thinking about nuclear deterrence, and particularly the deterrence relationship. I guess this is contentious if North Korea is actually in any kind of deterrence relationship right now at the nuclear level with the United States. But the North Koreans certainly recognize the asymmetry here. And Wilfred, you emphasized, or I guess you discussed Tanya's emphasis of ambiguity for the North Koreans. Ambiguity, secrecy, opacity, all of these things, I think, for the North Koreans are a feature and not a bug. I think they see these facets of how the outside world thinks about their nuclear capabilities as effectively contributing to deterrence. They don't have the same kind of, let's say, confidence that the United States might have in its own nuclear forces. The U.S., for everything we do criticize the United States for on arms control and transparency, it's actually one of the most transparent nuclear states on several measures. So how in this environment, when you have this highly asymmetric deterrence relationship between a very resource poor country trying to hold at risk the territory of the world's foremost military superpower on the other side of the planet, in this environment, I mean, how do you even begin to manage nuclear risk when it comes to a place like North Korea?
Well, I think you hit at a quite important point, which is that risk is quite complex. And actually, John in his chapter brings this example that U.S. missile defense really exists in ways to prevent escalation possibilities with the DPRK, with North Korea. And this is seen by the U.S. as a risk reduction measure. But the pursuit of missile defense can have long-term destabilizing effects with other states, including China and Russia, for instance, that can impact on risk in the long term. And so these dyads, these relationships don't really exist in isolation. And so these developments that can have cascading effects and impact on risk are certainly quite relevant in today's more interconnected environment. And so in terms of managing risk, in terms of risk reduction, I think you really have to account for the fact that interpretation and perception plays such a huge role in that. And so what can you do to kind of lower the possibility for misperception? You have to have some sort of strategic engagement on dialogue on these issues.
Yeah,
I
mean,
could
yes,
I add
yeah, John, jump in.
something to that, and Keith? I mean, you made the interesting point about, the deterrence relationship, whether it exists between North Korea and the US. Well, it's actually unclear whether a nuclear deterrence relationship exists between China and the US. I mean, the United States has never formally acknowledged that it's vulnerable to China's nuclear deterrent in a way that it has in its relationship strategically with And one of the things that some experts, I think namely Tong Zhao, a Chinese scholar, have been calling for is that one useful step in the US-China strategic relationship could be a mutual recognition that they're vulnerable to each other. And then on the basis of that, you can start to build up some kind of practical measures on that basis. The bottom line here is that some of the things that nuclear armed states do in peacetime, because it adds to the credibility of their nuclear deterrent, and that can be practices that are, for example, not transparent or are secretive, or they could involve commingling conventional and nuclear forces, for instance, as China is alleged to have done with some of its missile forces. These might be of benefit to them in peacetime, but they can be deeply destabilizing in a crisis, because the ambiguity that those behaviors or particular capabilities that they have can actually lead to confusion in terms of decision-making time for decision makers in crisis.
That's right. No, I think John, that's a great point about a declaration of mutual vulnerability. Yes, that's certainly not the case right now for China. China does have sustained concerns about the survivability of its own nuclear forces, leading to, I think, a deepening of mistrust and strategic anxiety. I personally don't see this administration getting there, given I think there are some questions actually about whether this administration would even acknowledge vulnerability about Russia in an official setting, contrary to some of its predecessors. And I think when in China and Russia, people look at things like the U.S. Missile Defense Review, the latest Missile Defense Agency budget submission, I think they find American reassurances that homeland missile defense, or missile defense capable of intercepting intercontinental range missiles, is exclusively designed for use against North Korea and potentially other so-called rogue states in the future. And they very much see a program directed at themselves. I mean, especially when the United States releases videos of F-35s destroying Russian road mobile Topol-M ballistic missile launchers. This was actually a thing that happened a few weeks ago. So there are I think several concerns here. But anyways, before we get too drawn into the offense-defense balance and missile defense, John, I think you've kind of opened the door to talking a little bit about the role of emerging technologies. Certainly, I think Asia is one of the spaces where many of these technologies are coming to bear in important ways, not only in the realm of nuclear weapons, but also conventional. I mean, we had a October 1st military parade in China that featured things like the PLA Strategic Support Force, a number of advanced autonomous capabilities, potentially with artificial intelligence imbuing their capabilities, things like the GJ-11 Sharp Sword autonomous unmanned combat vehicle. So tell us a little bit about the role of the emerging technologies that you see to be the most important in the nuclear space. You referenced some of these when you were introducing yourself and your work, but it'd be great to hear a little bit more about how these play out in the space of nuclear risk.
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned sort of a smorgasbord of technologies, and of course, we are crystal ball gazing a bit. We don't know, the future, and we don't know which of these technologies are going to become the most important. For example, a lot of experts feel there's quite a bit of hype about hypersonic weapons, and that their impact will actually be overstated. But I was talking about a brace of technologies, including these advanced long-range missiles, cyber, AI, anti-satellite weapons, even lower-yield, high-precision nuclear weapons, can be thought of in this way. They kind of do four things, which can be, or one or more of four things, which can kind of contribute to a destabilized situation. And the first thing is that some of these technologies are going to offer defenses or means of undermining rivals' missile and space capabilities. And beyond exploding or kinetic hit-to-kill interceptor missiles or projectiles, these kind of capabilities can extend even to left-of-launch capabilities like cyber or directed energy technologies. And the second thing is that some of these capabilities, and that could include hypersonic glide vehicles or these long-range stealthy precision missiles with conventional warheads, they could perform missions that were once reserved for nuclear weapons. And these kind of missions include destroying an adversary's nuclear forces or attacking their nuclear early warning and command and control systems. So you could even add forms of cyber and electronic intrusion to that. These things could undermine operators' confidence in the reliability of their command and control systems. Mm-hmm. And the third way is that some of these advances can permit more effective tracking of the adversary's nuclear forces. And one of my favorite phrases that's cropped up, and I'm sure you've run across this, Ankit, is this kind of concept of exquisite awareness, that somehow sort of a combination of sensors and artificial intelligence will allow, a state to know where most or all of an adversary's mobile nuclear platforms happen to be, so that in principle it might preemptively destroy those. I don't think that's ever going to be the case in practice, but it's kind of a temptation for states to try to move toward that in terms of technologies like better satellite remote sensing, electronic barriers, and more sophisticated and autonomous sensors, combined with machine learning and kind of AI techniques. And then the fourth way is, of course, new nuclear weapons with themselves, with higher precision and lower explosive yields than we used to historically. And this could permit nuclear deterrence to be more tailored, as the deterrence planners would put it, and that means more believable or more credible. But arguably, it also makes these weapons more usable, because plans are being put in place for their use against battlefield and other military targets, because they need to appear credible or believable. And so you can kind of get these self-reinforcing situations.
Right. Well, John, that was quite the tour de force. I think every sentence you just uttered, I think, could be the setup for an entire podcast, or potentially a lot more than that. But I think, unfortunately, though, we can't go further into the emerging technology space, even though I'd love to do that.
There's a lot there.
Yeah. I know, yeah, for reasons of time. But I think that's great for our listeners to be just aware of many of these issues. It is really a huge issue, and that's actually a lot of the work that Unidir has been doing. Has been around the role of potential emerging technologies. I myself have been lucky enough to be involved with Wilfred and John on work on hypersonic boost glide weapons, for instance, which is something that I think UN member states are beginning to think about in a more systematic and serious way. So hopefully that will be sustained through the next years, as many of these technologies do. Some of them enter the operational space after R&D and testing, while others are simply in the R&D phase. So it's important to understand how they're going to bear on things like nuclear risk in the real world. Before we close out, I don't want to forget about South Asia. I talked about this a little bit at the beginning of the podcast. It's certainly a part of Asia that I'm personally quite interested in, and including nuclear risk. Manpreet Sethi wrote a great chapter looking at nuclear risk issues in South Asia, or Southern Asia, rather. Southern Asia includes, in a way, China's role in its deterrence relationship with India, and certainly India and Pakistan's own relationship. It's really, when we talk about Southern Asia, we're talking about that triangle that really arises, that makes things a little bit more complex. And we had, I think the whole world had a wake-up call, 21 years after the Indian and Pakistani nuclear tests in 1998, last February, when India and Pakistan were at the brink of an all-out war after a major skirmish in Kashmir. Wilfred, tell us a little bit about how our listeners can really think about nuclear risk issues in South Asia. What are the main pathways here?
Yeah, Manpreet really did write a great chapter, and you brought up the incident last year, the Balakot crisis, and I think it really encapsulates the different risk issues, underlying conditions, and driving factors that can lead to a potential use of nuclear weapons in Southern Asia. It highlights, obviously, the long-standing tension and conflict that has existed between the two sides, including over territorial disputes. It highlighted the asymmetries in capabilities between the two sides, in terms of the doctrines, the idea about the role of nuclear weapons, which has led one side or the other to test some of the boundaries, and this can really lower the threshold for nuclear weapon use. It also highlighted some developments in capabilities that, frankly, limits the decision-making time that one side or the other has in these crisis situations, and can exacerbate the possibility of misperception or miscalculation. And of course, the presence of terrorist actors in the region can add a degree of instability insofar as these crisis situations as well.
Right. So before we close out this very fascinating discussion, I did want to offer you both just a chance to give us some last thoughts and maybe tell us a little bit about where Unidir's work on nuclear risk reduction might be going next. John, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, a lot of the work that I'm doing at the moment is, as you mentioned before, Ankit, it's thinking about the impacts of some of these strategic technologies and what that's going to mean for the nuclear balance and stability, but also, how arms control and disarmament approaches can play a useful role in that. But something else that I'm also looking a lot at, and I think that this relates to nuclear risk, but also more broadly to issues around the international system that we live in, is this relationship between nuclear deterrence and disarmament. Because on the one side, all states in the world talk about the desire to one day achieve general and complete disarmament and a nuclear weapon-free world, but that's not the direction, in fact, that we've moved over the last several decades. And, the majority of the world's population live in countries that rely on nuclear weapons for security, and they give every indication of continuing to. So there's this tension between nuclear deterrence and disarmament and these other norms which are really important of non-proliferation, of non-use of nuclear weapons. So how do these relate with each other, and how do we feasibly move to a situation over time where nuclear risk can be reduced permanently, enduringly, by actually phasing these weapons out without without having unacceptable security costs for countries that rely on these weapons for their security at the moment.
And Wilfred, any final closing thoughts from you?
Sure. I think when we talk about risk reduction, we're also talking about risk awareness, right? And basically, the work that we're doing hopes to increase awareness of how these different pathways to potential nuclear use might take place. I think in this kind of environment, it's critical for policymakers and other state actors to step back and revisit some of the assumptions they're making, and to consider how doctrines, postures, capabilities, modernization programs, etc., can be interpreted or misinterpreted by the other side, and consequently how that impacts on risk. And so as we move forward with this risk framing, we want to visit more in depth some of these dynamics of risk and some of these action-reaction dynamics that we've talked about on this podcast today.
Well, I want to thank you both for taking time out of your busy days to join me on the Asia Geopolitics podcast to talk about this. I will include a link to the report in the show notes for the episode, so if listeners want to follow up and take their minds off the global pandemic by reading about nuclear weapons risk, they'll be obviously very free to do that. But John, thanks so much for joining me today. And Wilfred.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Wilfred, thank you for joining me as well.
It's our pleasure, Ankit.
Great. So for our listeners, thanks again for listening to the Asia Geopolitics podcast. If you like what you heard on the show, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, please do leave us a review. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, TuneIn, any other number of podcast providers out there. We really do appreciate that. And finally, a quick note about our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risk. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.